V2 ballistic rocket should have enabled Hitler to avoid defeat. It was designed by a brilliant 25-year-old engineer, Werner von Braun. As World War II developed, the Nazi regime intended to launch thousands of groundbreaking arms programs. This film recounts this little-known story, revealing some of the miracle weapons Hitler hoped would change the course of the war. The people identify with their Führer. Germany is mobilized and Hitler triumphs. He wants war. The Nazi regime seizes power.
In the eyes of the Germans in 1933, Hitler embodies an escape route, a way out of the crisis and of humiliation, a role he would create and implement extremely effectively.
1936, and Hitler decides to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. The Reich represents 60 million Germans. As of 1934, intensive research has been carried out into new weapons.
Hitler mentions new weapons in a speech in 1939. All new arms programs are by definition secret to start with. What they were doing was completely new. It is certain that Nazi Germany pumped considerable sums of money into new armaments programs from the outset. Quite simply, the German army was very weak when the Nazis gained power. And all at once, the new regime invests money, finds engineers and manpower, and launches widespread innovative research.
It is on the Baltic coast in 1936 that Hitler decides to create a vast research center, Peenemünde, in order to develop revolutionary weapons. The army develops the V2 missile, the Luftwaffe the V1 flying bomb. Such weapons were not even considered by other nations. At the time, it was the biggest laboratory in the world devoted entirely to weapons.
These new weapons would only become operational in the second part of the war, as of 1943.
Hitler rearms Germany with a view to waging war. He's always said this, it's no secret. Rearmament involves what we could call classic weapons, but they're extremely effective, as they're really the state of the art in terms of what exists at the time.
The Messerschmitt 109 would be a formidable killing machine. Near Paris, we meet a former printer reconstructing a replica. The fighter was used for too long due to the lack of replacements. And yet as early as 1940, Willy Messerschmitt had proposed to Hitler a revolutionary twin-engined interceptor that would have outclassed all Allied aircraft.
When war broke out, they realized that the 109 was superior to all the other aircraft that were on the market at the time, be they British or Russian. The 109 that I'm building is based on a shell that I was able to recover in Spain, in an exchange deal with a museum in Madrid. The plane was more or less in a junkyard state, so I had to start from scratch. I began building it in 1985 and use every original piece I can find, even from crashes. There are parts that were handled by at least 4 flyers in the cockpit. When someone touches the controls, they were handled by a pilot during the war. That's the way I work.
In order to reach greater speeds, fighters are tested using rocket motors. Results are encouraging. The Heinkel 178 would be the first jet to fly anywhere in the world.
The Germans were the first to fly using this engine. The question we can ask is why they were the first. Are they better than the others? I don't think so. I think the answer is very different. It's more political. Heinkel wants to gain an advantage over Messerschmitt, so he builds this machine and flies it, and based on that he hopes to gain favor with Hitler to mass produce it, and obviously get rich. But the fact is that he doesn't succeed. The first jet-engined planes built by Heinkel are far from being in perfect working order. There's still a great deal of work to be done.
The lack of an established strategy leads the Nazis to stop the intensive development of jet engines. And yet they represented a considerable technological advance.
There was another twin-engined plane designed by Ernst Heinkel which had flown in 1939, so why was this plane not mass-produced? There was a problem with the motor. It wasn't powerful enough and it worked badly. There was a problem with the plane, too, which wasn't designed to fly at very high speeds. It was too heavy. So all this meant too much time was needed to fine-tune the program, and that's why Hitler stopped it. He wanted something that worked right away.
September 1939, Germany crushes the Polish army. Hitler has a vast stock of traditional weapons. May 1940, the combination of armored divisions and airstrikes devastates the French army. The Führer is convinced his lightning war will soon lead to complete victory.
He was surprised by the swiftness of his victories, but this would convince him that he would be able to take over the western part of the USSR within 3 months. And here, he commits a number of monumental errors. He gives the order to his industries to stop working on the development of any material which wouldn't be ready within 6 months. He stops work on developing long-range bombers, 4-engined planes, for example. He would favor the twin-engined bombers, judging that as long as he had the greater numbers, which wasn't necessarily false, then that would suffice.
Goering is a very special case. First of all, Goering is one of Hitler's first companions, and he was the creator of a new weapon in the military sense, which was the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He was a very powerful personality in the Nazi system, politically and militarily, but also economically, as he was responsible for the Nazi war economy before Speer. And so on several occasions he made bad choices in terms of technology, tactics and strategy.
German companies fought a tough battle for production contracts. The political aspect came into play in a significant manner. Practically, in the case of the Air Ministry, when a specification was given, several companies attempted to produce prototypes, and quite often it wasn't the best prototype that would be retained, but rather that of the company that was the most highly regarded politically. That's how the Messerschmitt company managed to sideline their competitors, like Henkel, for example, which also made very good aircraft, but which didn't have Hitler's approval in the same way.
In 1940, the Battle of Britain is at its height. The German squadrons are decimated. It's the Nazis' first defeat.
Since the beginning of the conflict, the British have managed to control the Atlantic zone and therefore secure their supply routes from the USA. The moment the Germans are incapable of dominating the Atlantic, then they lose the control of the seas across the world.
Very rapidly, as of September 1940, submarines dock in the French Atlantic ports and begin operations in the North Atlantic to counter the Allies' convoys.
August 1940, Hitler orders a blockade on Britain. Admiral Dönitz launches endless U-boat attacks. For 3 years, they will sink hundreds of Allied ships. The Nazi submarines rule over the Atlantic until they're outclassed. June 1941, the Wehrmacht invades the USSR in Operation Barbarossa. Stalin is overrun and a vast new territory is conquered. The Red Army can only muster limited, obsolete weaponry. But after a blistering scorched earth attack, the Russian winter provides a brutal contrast. Over 1,000 kilometers of highways are built by Fritz Todt and his organization. He was also Minister for Armaments.
Todt was entrusted with implementing the armaments and munitions policy. And he was also very knowledgeable about the United States. In December 1941, he came to understand the importance of two concurrent events: the German army's failure to take Moscow and the United States joining the war subsequent to Pearl Harbor. He realized that strategically Nazi Germany would lose the war. So among Hitler's entourage, Todt was one of those who advocated ending the war against the Western Allies in order to concentrate the war effort against the USSR. It is therefore quite likely, despite the absence of formal proof, that the plane crash in which he was killed in February 1942 was not only due to technical reasons.
June 1940. Hitler visits Paris. To his right is 35-year-old Albert Speer. A close relationship would be established between the Führer and his favorite architect.
He was therefore replaced by Albert Speer. And in fact, we can certainly wonder if Germany didn't benefit from the change. Speer, who was an architect, perhaps had broader and more open-minded ideas. In any case, he succeeded in developing the German armaments industry to quite an extraordinary level.
The Führer appreciates Albert Speer, a creative man, well-organized and psychologically astute.
The key date in the Battle of the Atlantic is the month of May 1943. In a single month, the Germans lost 41 submarines. 41 submarines were lost. The English call it Black May, which is very telling. In the weeks that followed, Admiral Dönitz was in a state of shock, and he quite simply ordered the submarines not to navigate anymore in the North Atlantic. So what did he do? He simply went to see Albert Speer, and Albert Speer suggested to Admiral Dönitz that he take direct charge of the production of submarines with new organizational resources. In August 1943, the Germans began to set up a special engineering studies bureau which would bring together the best engineers from each of the companies involved in submarine production. In just a few months, they managed to draw up plans for 2 new submarines, which were completely revolutionary for the period. And these were the submarine types 21 and 23. The Type 21 is an ocean-going submarine of 1,600 tons. In the end, they chose the most feasible elements from each project and transposed them onto a single project, the Type 21 submarine. Its principal characteristic is that it's very hydrodynamic. It's built to travel very quickly underwater. There are no more heavy guns or artillery on deck, just a few anti-aircraft guns and streamlined turrets. It is supplied with high-capacity electric batteries, which enable it to sail and dive for much longer periods than its predecessors. It travels and attacks underwater, but it's also designed so that it doesn't have to recharge its batteries on the surface. And to do this, it has a snorkel, a kind of tube which enables the diesel motor to operate. The submarine can remain underwater with just its periscope out of the water and charge its batteries without surfacing, and this is important, as in this way the submarine is no longer detectable by radar and largely avoids the Allies' countermeasures. One of the submarine's more innovative elements is that it's constructed in prefabricated sections, so there are 3 shipyards assembling the sections which were built at other German metalworking companies along the river network. The first vessel, the U-2501, was launched at a shipyard in Bremen on Hitler's birthday. But it should be said that the vessel was immediately moored along the dockside afterwards, as it was unable to dive. It would never be fit for navigation. It was so far from being ready that it would require many months to make it seaworthy, and then it was only used for operational duties and never engaged in combat.
The 21 could stay submerged for 62 hours and would be the best U-boat. Copied by the Soviets, NATO would commission several in the Whiskey class.
Other projects arose, notably concerning midget submarines. Another development was a small vessel called the Sea Teufel, or Sea Devil, which was essentially used to drop agents or sabotage teams close to enemy coasts.
The Führer and the fanatics around him wanted the ultimate weapon, the atomic bomb. In 1938, the German physicist Otto Hahn had demonstrated atomic fission. The Nazis had a certain advance. In the race for the bomb, several German teams were working intensively with the aim of destroying America.
Speer becomes Minister for Armaments in February 1942. At that point, an initial meeting is convened at the War Ministry, I think, on the subject of nuclear energy. Most of the German scientists took part. And I believe it was Milch who asked Heisenberg what size an atomic bomb would be. Heisenberg mimed a pineapple. That represents about 15 kilos of uranium. Speer subsequently asked Heisenberg how much money would be required. And Heisenberg replied with such a ridiculously low figure that Speer said to Milch, "Well, I think the subject really isn't sufficiently developed, so we can't continue with it." And at the time, in 1942, the Americans had already decided on the Manhattan Project. But the Germans, who were perhaps still ahead of the Americans, abandoned the idea.
For a long time, it was thought that Nazism was a pyramid power structure. But we know today from historical research that it was really a competitive jungle between different pressure groups, between the Nazi Party, the SS, and between leading industrialists and the all-powerful armaments minister, Albert Speer. In a way, Hitler was the arbiter who would from time to time favor one group or another.
The corporal of 1918 has become the Führer. A self-taught man, he has to choose among the new weapons. His entourage manipulates him and lies to him. 1942-1943. On the Eastern Front, the Nazis are facing total defeat. They attempt to reverse the trend by using unprecedented weaponry.
Hitler was always attracted to rather pharaonic projects. Anything that was grand and colossal appealed to him. This was the case with architecture notably, or the long-range cannons. We could mention the 600mm gun for firing on Sebastopol. Hitler was always drawn to this type of pharaonic project.
For the Dora siege gun, 1,000 men were required to set it up. It traveled on 2 parallel rail tracks.
At the beginning of World War II, the Germans had one strength that the others lacked. They had considerable military transport capabilities. Their planes were the Junker 52s, a transport plane that dated from the 30s. As of 1940, they lost substantial numbers of Junker 52s. The army staff decided to find replacements. Messerschmitt had the idea of building a glider, a machine that could be towed to the battlefield and able to land in a very restricted area and almost be disposable. Messerschmitt manufactured this huge glider, a monster in which they could put a 105mm cannon and transport up to 60 men. And it worked well. The problem was that it required a big bomber to tow it. As a solution, they decided to put engines on the glider. France was still making motors at this time, and so they used French engines. It was the biggest transport plane in the Second World War.
The Germans are surrounded at Stalingrad. Some of the 200 Messerschmitt Gigant 323s manage to break the blockade, but cannot transport enough arms and supplies. The Dornier 335 is surprisingly modern, with a speed of 750 kilometers an hour. Its engines are supercharged with the injection of water and methanol, but only a few dozen see combat in October 1943.
The Treaty of Versailles had a dual effect on German industry. It obliged engineers to work with very small engines, and so to develop highly effective aerodynamics. And it delayed the development of more powerful motors. As of 1943, it's clear to the Germans that they won't be able to produce powerful engines like the British and the Americans, that is, engines between 1,600 and 1,700 horsepower. The only way to counter the lack of power is aerodynamics. So to reduce the drag, rather than put two engines on each side of the fuselage, Dornier decided to put one engine on the front of the fuselage, like a single-engined fighter, and a second engine at the rear. The drag was considerably reduced and they could go much faster. They didn't wait for the prototypes to be perfected. The pressure meant that 100 or so machines were developed as they went along. It was an extremely successful plane. It was very, very quick. Allied pilots who encountered it, even though they had very fast planes themselves, the Tempests or Mustangs, weren't able to catch it. But it arrived too late.
Engineer Ferdinand Porsche is a self-taught man. Since 1934, he's been working on an affordable car, a project supported by Hitler. In 1938, the car is ready. Ferdinand Porsche sits in the back, Hitler is in the front, next to the driver, Ferry, Porsche's son. It's Hitler's 55th birthday. The Austrian engineer is present. He's a member of the inner circle. In 1942, Porsche shows Hitler a model of a future 188-ton monster, with armor plating 60 to 240 millimeters thick. Despite the drawback of a slow speed, it should have been produced in greater numbers.
The Maus tank weighed in at 150 tons, and I believe was developed by the Porsche company using private funding with Hitler's approval, but against the advice of the army, which didn't want to develop this type of vehicle. It took a number of years to develop the machine. From 41 through 43, several prototypes were built and tested on army test grounds, at Kummersdorf, for example. It would appear that Hitler believed that vehicles such as the Maus would turn military operations in his favor.
Hitler sees the tank being used like a bunker on caterpillar tracks. The Maus is waterproof and can cross rivers, avoiding unsafe bridges. The Soviets captured several, and one example can be seen in a museum near Moscow. In the summer of 1943, Hitler loses the Battle of Kursk in the USSR. 6,000 tanks faced off in a deadly duel. The Nazis have virtually lost the war.
In reality, the state of mind of the Nazi leaders at the end of 1943 is one of panic. They have just understood that they're going to lose the war because they're confronted with a very powerful coalition. This leads them to launch a great number of new arms programs, even if the programs are incomplete or have never been technically proven. They invest money and men, often to a very stupid extent.
Germany finds itself in a very particular situation. It lacks raw materials and has known this from the start. But it's also beginning to lack manpower, as the losses have been enormous. Hitler thinks that through innovative technology he can compensate for the insufficient numbers with efficient equipment. And so he encourages certain avant-garde programs, and in particular jet-propelled planes, and also helicopters. In Germany, there was a man called Heinrich Focke. He had a passionate interest in helicopters for personal reasons, but also because it enabled him to step aside from the Nazi regime, which he didn't much like. In the USA was a Russian immigrant called Igor Sikorsky. Focke managed to build a helicopter with two rotors, which simplified a lot of problems. His little machine worked quite well, so it was decided to build a much bigger one with a motor of 1,000 horsepower. It too appeared to work very well, and as the German way of working at the time was not to wait for prototypes to be perfected, several hundred of them were ordered. The helicopter was capable of lifting heavy loads to high altitudes and was theoretically a fine machine. But it was never put into service due to a lack of time. The war ended. Antoine Fletner's Hummingbird would be used on ships for similar purposes. It was easier to maneuver than a plane on a catapult, very quick to prepare, and it was capable of observation missions far ahead of the ships. But the project went no further.
The Deutsches Museum in Munich, where curators have brought together a vast collection of miracle weapons. One of the most surprising is the Natter, or snake. This wooden rocket plane was built in late 1944 to intercept Allied flying fortresses at altitudes of up to 12,000 meters. The Walter rocket engine was recovered after each launch.
Only 12 examples of the Natter were constructed, and they were only used for testing. The pilot was killed during the first test flight. It was an interceptor rocket. The front was composed of a concrete block which held a dozen rockets to be fired in a group to destroy enemy bombers. After this desperate mission, the rear of the plane was parachuted down to the ground. The motor was reusable, and so it was marked, "A reward will be given to anyone finding this plane." The pilot, too, was supposed to land by parachute.
In 1943, something happened that was very important for the future of German aeronautics, and that was the Allied air offensive over Germany. The night attacks got worse. There were daylight attacks too, and they caused considerable damage. At this point, they looked at everything they had in their laboratories to try and produce something operational immediately. One of the first things that was done, for example, was to take rocket motors and put them on a glider that Messerschmitt had studied, and so they made the Me-163, which is a veritable piloted missile. This machine was able to climb to the altitude of flying fortresses in 1 minute. The speed at which it sliced through the flying fortresses was mind-boggling, and it wreaked havoc and panic among the American crews. It was armed with heavy 30mm guns, and a single 30mm shell against a flying fortress would knock it out of the sky for sure. The problem was that the plane only had a range of 45 kilometers, so if it wasn't on the American plane's flight path, it was useless, as the motor only worked for about a minute. After that, it becomes a glider, a very fast glider, but only a glider. So it had to land in a field, and although it was designed for this, it was very vulnerable.
Before the war, sail-wing planes had enabled the Nazis to train pilots. The Horten brothers designed several such remarkable machines. In 1942, they built the HO-229 flying wing. The wing surface was made of an almost undetectable material. It was the first stealth plane.
With the state of panic that dominated Germany from 1944 on, they were trying to move as fast as possible. Studies were carried out on the flying wing because all aeronautical engineers know that a flying wing is theoretically more efficient than a standard airplane. There's no drag from the fuselage, no drag from the empennage. You can go much faster and much further. The Horten brothers manufactured this flying wing, and with the state of panic Germany was in then, yes, the project was good to go. They were provided with jet engines, and they managed to fly 2 prototypes. It was therefore known that these machines could fly correctly, but there were enormous stability problems. The flying wing is very interesting, and so interesting, in fact, that work is still being done on it in the 21st century.
$2 billion, the cost of the American stealth plane, the B-2. Dozens of studies into jet bombers were carried out too. Only the Arado 234 would carry out any missions.
The problem with these German planes is that the turboreactors were only first generation and they lacked power. This meant they couldn't build planes capable of carrying any great weight, so they could only put 1 man on board. 2 jet planes were being prepared, a Messerschmitt and an Arado. and they would only be put into service in the summer of 1944.
During tests, the landing gear was too heavy and was replaced by a trolley system. Reusable rockets were used to facilitate takeoff. One version, with an additional fuel tank shaped like a V1, was studied. 14 four-engine planes would be built in all.
The first mission the plane was given was for reconnaissance, and it was quite astounding because it could fly at an altitude of 10,000 meters and a speed of 600 kilometers per hour, and was completely invulnerable. An Arado 264 that was based in Reims in June 1944 went every day to photograph the Normandy landings. It brought back thousands of photographs of the German defeat as it was actually happening. The Arado was extremely effective, and Hitler was determined to make a bomber out of it, which was done. There was the famous attack by these planes on the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, which were intercepted with great difficulty by British planes. In fact, they built a series of prototypes, a series of demonstration models, but they really weren't good combat aircraft. The British and American general staffs would soon realize that these machines had certain limits.
The Me-262, a twin-engine swept-wing fighter, could reach 850 kilometers per hour. 1,100 were constructed. It was the most surprising fighter of the war.
Willy Messerschmitt in particular promised Hitler that he would give him an extremely fast and capable jet plane with sufficient autonomy, and this was the Me-262. In his madness, Hitler saw war only as offensive, and by definition, the offensive aircraft is the bomber, so he wanted the plane to be a bomber. Messerschmitt wasn't thinking about bombers. He was thinking about a very fast plane, a fighter. The priority for the general staff was fighters to stop the enemy. So what happened is that the general staff lied to Hitler. The Me-262 was held up because of the engines. The jet engines were very difficult to perfect. Planes that arrived, apparently finished, broke down very frequently. It's estimated that only 25% of the planes were really available. Another problem with the jet planes was that they traveled too fast compared to the target. And when you fly much faster than a target, it only gives you maybe a second or half a second to aim and fire.
On Hitler's orders, General Galland organizes a special Me-262 squadron. The volunteer pilots are all experienced. Galland is impressed by the Me-262's potential, attacking the flying fortresses at 850 kilometers per hour. The Allies react quickly and attack the planes during takeoff and landing. The Anglo-American strategy concerning aeronautical production is very different. America becomes the Allies' arsenal. With mastery of the skies being imperative, huge aircraft production plants are built. 12,700 B-17 flying fortresses designed by Boeing before the war were built under license by 4 other constructors. The Nazis produced new planes that were sophisticated but unfinished and only in small numbers.
The Luftwaffe had constantly told Hitler that it was capable of winning the conflict by itself. But it soon found itself dominated by British and American aviation. And so Göring was always looking for some new way of gaining aerial supremacy, like with the V1, because it was the Luftwaffe that launched the V1 program.
The V1 is intended to demoralize the British. It carries 830 kilos of explosives, a little more than the V2 rocket, but it costs 1,000 times less. V1s were launched over a 10-month period from 96 launch pads in France. Nazi bombers having failed over London, Göring proposes a solution, the V1. It's a flying bomb, a self-propelled weapon. The V1 has a small propeller at the end of the fuselage connected to an anemometric counter, which calculates the distance. The counter is designed to cut off the fuel supply and make the bomb fall on its target. The bomb is difficult to counter by fighters, as they have to travel at maximum speeds. But the V1's biggest drawback is the noise from the motor. They can be identified well before impact. The V1s are often intercepted by gunfire, flak, and balloons. More than 8,000 were launched from France. It's estimated that almost 50% of them reached their targets.
Goebbels was unfailingly loyal to Hitler, but he was also sometimes a realistic man. He understood quite quickly that the war was turning against the Nazis. In June 1944, when a new weapon came into service, the V1, the flying bomb, he invented a propaganda slogan and called it the Vergeltungswaffe 1, or retaliation weapon number 1. And the word retaliation was intended to present the V1 as a response to Allied bombing, and so boost the morale of the German people.
Die höhnische Frage aufgeworfen, ob die neue Waffe, die ich dort angekündigt hätte, etwa im Propagandaministerium statt im Rüstungsministerium erfunden worden wäre. Ich habe es damals nicht für meine Aufgabe gehalten, die Engländer eines Besseren zu belehren, sondern ich war im Gegenteil der Überzeugung, je länger sie glauben, dass sie nicht kommt, umso besser ist es. Denn die Überraschung ist auch eine Waffe.
The V2 was the Nazis' most sophisticated weapon, achieving speeds of 5,600 kilometers per hour. 738 kilos of explosives were carried. The first successful launch was on October 3, 1942. Hitler congratulated Walter Dornberger and von Braun.
Why were the Germans interested in rockets, whereas no other country at the time was actively involved? Because designing a rocket was a way around the treaty.
At the meeting in August 1941, at his headquarters with Dornberger and von Braun, Hitler pronounced these words, that propulsion by liquid fuel was a revolution in the art of war and a modification in world strategy.
Everything changed on the night of the 17th to 18th of August 1943. The English launched Operation Hydra with 593 bombers attacking the secret Peenemünde base on the Baltic coast. The next morning, Himmler obtained an audience with Hitler, and he explained that he had a solution for protecting the rocket production. He suggested using concentration camp labor to construct a gigantic underground factory, which would be the infamous Mittelbau Dora camp. Himmler would be given the go-ahead. The SS were gradually taking over.
In the final part of the war, there was a new essential player, and that was the SS, Himmler, whose ambition was to create a veritable SS state. Within the German industrial system, he wanted to take over the new technological developments. He realized that the V2s were essential for the future. And so at the head of the missile programs, he appointed an extremely complex man by the name of Hans Kammler. He was an SS general, trained as an engineer, but we mustn't forget that he was also the man who designed the gas chambers at Auschwitz.
Kammler played a key role in the final solution, overseeing the construction of gas chambers. With brutal efficiency, Kammler had 20 kilometers of tunnels dug out of the rock at the Mittelwerk facility.
Not only did he take control of the manufacture of the V2 rockets, but also of all the underground Mittelwerk factories in the Harz, where they made V2s, V1s, and the Rheintochter missiles, as well as jet engines for the new jet planes.
Himmler employed concentration camp inmates as slave labor to build the vast underground factory. More than 60,000 workers were the victims of barbaric brutality. 20,000 of them died. The head of the SS made them build a camp complex close to the factory. The Americans would later discover several thousand dead bodies. The SS were responsible for more victims than Hitler's miracle weapons themselves.
In 1943, the Nazi Reich decided to employ its new weapon, the V2 rocket. To do so, they needed launch installations within range of the target, which means around 200 kilometers from London. This is why they chose northern France to build their installations.
4 giant 380mm guns were also installed in the Tot artillery factory at Cap Grinet to bombard the English coast and ships in the Channel.
At first, the Germans built a classic blockhouse, but this was soon destroyed by Allied planes.
The bunker of Eperlec was intended to launch V2 rockets and produce liquid oxygen. It was the target of several air raids, severely damaged and finally abandoned. Not a single V2 would be launched from here.
And so it was decided at the end of August 1943 to build an underground complex and to protect the complex with a gigantic circular blockhouse, the coupole. The problem for the Germans was how to build in just a few weeks this gigantic reinforced concrete structure and to stop enemy bombing from damaging the building site. They therefore developed a new technique which consisted of building a huge mold on top of the plateau where we are now and then pouring onto the surface of the mold a mass composed of 55,000 tons of reinforced concrete. And when the concrete solidified, they removed the mold. And so the site was immediately protected, a site which was essentially underground. The mission here was to stock several hundred V2 rockets and to prepare them for launching. The mechanism is very complex and uses liquid oxygen and alcohol, which requires very precise handling. The third mission was to launch the rockets against London, which is about 190 kilometers from the site.
The new bunker would never be used.
The site was discovered by the Allied secret services in the month of September 1944. They were mistakenly overjoyed, believing they had eliminated the danger. But then 3 days later, on September 8th, the first V2s were launched. The first against Paris and the second against London, from Belgium and Holland. So there was a shift from fixed launch sites to mobile launch sites, which would be the future tactic for missiles in the late 20th century. The V2 is fundamentally a psychological weapon. It's a terrorist weapon. The Germans were hoping to destroy the Londoners' morale by launching offensives day and night against the capital.
Aimed at London, the V3 cannon was supposed to fire 120 shells a day.
In the summer of 1943, another new arms project was launched for a new cannon called a multi-charge gun with gigantic tubes of about 150 meters long. The state of panic among the German leaders led them at the same time to invest in the manufacture of the gun and begin the construction of a firing site near Calais in France. But the problem was that this type of gun, where secondary propellant charges are fired as the projectile passes in the tube, was not technically perfected in 1943-1944.
It was only on the 7th of July 1944 that a raid by 16 Lancaster bombers, each carrying a 6-ton bomb, attacked the Momoyek site. 2 of the 16 bombs reached their targets. By some extraordinary chance, one of them landed in an opening. It entered a tunnel and exploded below ground, causing part of the lower level to collapse.
The multi-charge supergun site at Mimoyek near Calais was never operational, and so the Germans were reduced to using a smaller version, about 60 meters long, which fired several dozen lightweight shells on the city of Luxembourg.
In his headquarters in eastern Germany, Hitler has become an old man. His health is failing, he has heart disease and is showing the first signs of Parkinson's disease, says General Hans Guderian. Hitler now wears gloves in order to hide the worsening disease. He salutes his officers with his left hand. The Führer is fading fast. The SS has taken power and the Reich is dying. Among the 2,000 to 3,000 different weapons projects studied, several types of innovative missiles were developed, the aim being to intercept bombers and ships.
Hier sehen Sie zwei Flugkörper. Das eine, das größere Objekt, das ist die
Here we have two missiles. The biggest is the Heinschel 293.
wurde eben speziell entwickelt als Bombe, die
It was especially designed to be a radio-controlled bomb.
eingesetzt werden sollte und auch teilweise eingesetzt worden ist.
It was mainly to be used against naval targets,
Flugkörper noch an die 2000.
but this happened only rarely.
Das Besondere an dieser Bombe ist eben, dass diese Bombe unter ihrem Rumpf
2,000 of these Heinschel missiles were built.
dass die Bombe beschleunigt und der Flugzeugbesatzung die Möglichkeit gibt, die Bombe noch
What's
etwas
unusual
zu
about this bomb
korrigieren, so die Treffer
is that it has a rocket motor beneath the fuselage,
natürlich auch die Besatzung des
which can accelerate the device,
höheren Sicherheitsgrad
giving the crew the ability to adjust its trajectory and so increase the precision of the impact.
viel früher abdrehen kann und nicht in
It improved security for the crew
Abwehr
as the bomb glided towards its target.
Man hat für die Flugbahn-Berechnung
During the Second World War,
bereits
these missiles were equipped with computers to calculate their trajectories.
die hießen damals
They were the first computers, although they weren't called that.
Kalkül.
They were called elektrischer Plankalkül.
Zweiten Weltkrieges oder in der Endphase des Zweiten Weltkrieges eine
Towards the end, in the final months of World War II,
Deutschland
a great number of spectacular projects were developed in Germany.
Notwendigkeiten, sondern diese entsprechenden
They weren't only motivated by military demands,
wollten natürlich
but also because the R&D institutes and companies
Wissenschaftler auch sich selbst
wanted to keep their people busy so they weren't sent to the front.
ersparen. Deshalb wurden solche exotische Apparate gebaut.
That's why so many rather exotic and unusual devices were built.
Wie heute, man hat nach Berlin tolle Berichte.
The heads of these programs sent glowing reports to Berlin,
Wir weiterentwickeln,
whereas most of the projects were not completed.
Wissenschaftler eigentlich bis in die letzten
The Nazi leaders in Berlin were desperate and so asked that the projects continue at any cost.
War das dann sehr lukrativ für die Alliierten.
1944, and the Allies have complete control over the skies.
Big Week was a week in which American bombers from the 8th Air Force concentrated on the German aeronautics industry. The bigger the sites were, the easier they were to locate and destroy. Under the armaments minister, Albert Speer, there were no longer any major jet plane production sites. There were a certain number of smaller sites, and the Germans even developed a clever system whereby a metal structure over a concrete base would be covered with camouflage nets, and in the middle of a forest, so it was totally invisible to Allied reconnaissance.
The Allies found hundreds of Me-262s in forests in Austria and Germany. Camouflaged workshops had been created. So they found them there, and all of them were missing something. They were missing an engine part or an instrument, or had no weapons or radios.
At the end of the war, fighters can only take off from stretches of highway.
The
Germans would carry out what the American historian Michael Neufeld has called the move underground. In practical terms, every tunnel, every salt mine would be used for some production process or other, for all manner of component manufacture and assembly. And ultimately, Germany was transformed into a gigantic decentralized workshop. There were a few production sites based in Bavaria with factories of various sizes. But essentially, tunnels were used to produce wing parts or jet engines, for example, and then the assembly would take place on other sites. But this system had dramatic consequences. It made transportation longer, and transport obviously means vulnerability to Allied air attacks.
The Nazis' final creation is the Heinkel 162A2 fighter. In desperation, Speer, Milch, and Himmler decide to produce a fighter that will be easy to build. The lack of strategic materials means the body is basically made of plywood. The design of the centrally positioned jet engine is innovative. It was designed for young pilots, but proved to be very difficult to maneuver.
Almost everything is revolutionary with this plane. It was designed in a very short time. Heinkel won the project in September, and the first prototype was built in November. The first flight took place in November. It was also revolutionary because it was the first single-engine jet fighter to have an ejector seat.
200 of them were built, but only a squad of 30 was deployed on the Danish front just 1 month before capitulation.
There was almost no cooperation in the field of weapons production between Germany, which had a considerable advance, and Italy or Japan, apart from certain trivial influences. For example, the Reichenberg suicide fighter, which came out of watching cinema newsreels of the Japanese kamikazes, who hurled themselves onto American aircraft carriers in the Pacific. At the end of 1944, a handful of SS leaders who were trying everything possible to find a solution had a series of pilot-controlled V1s built and tested by SS volunteers. And so this pointless project disappeared along with so many others in the collapse of the Third Reich.
In the spring of 1945, no miracle has worked and Hitler commits suicide. The Nazis' defeat is total. Berlin is devastated by Soviet bombs and a new war is on the horizon, the Cold War.
Obviously, those who won the war realized the importance of Peenemunde's legacy, and in the last weeks of the war they did their best to enroll the teams of engineers who had designed the V2. We know that both sides managed to recover some of the Peenemunde engineers and technical plans, with the big winners being the Americans, who managed to win over von Braun and his best engineers. The Soviets too got their hands on several hundred engineers who had worked on the V2. And we often forget France, who recovered around 60 engineers from the Nazis' rocket program, and who later worked for the French army and ultimately the Ariane program.
The secret weapons were finally only rarely used by the Germans, but they did contribute to opening up a new era in world strategy, which has given us 60 years of peace.